I'm a librarian at the University of South Alabama. That's my day job. And I was volunteering at the Union Archives at Oakley. And they had all of these style cabinets that people were exploring. Well, I'm a librarian. And so I was kind of like nosying around and looking in drawers. And I was discovering these fabulous stories. Stories not about soldiers fighting in the Civil War, mind you. Stories about women, children, enslaved, people who were in Mobile during the Civil War who couldn't leave, couldn't fight, senior citizens, babies, people who couldn't escape, who couldn't get out, and how they were surviving. And a librarian, I was looking around going, okay, somebody must have published these stories somewhere, right? They hadn't. I looked everywhere. A lot of these stories hadn't been published since the 1800s. And I was like, what's wrong with these people? Why are they focusing so much on the battles? The battles are interesting. I love visiting Civil War battlefields. I was just in Pittsburgh this past week. But I was like, that's great and all. They've got studies and all kinds of stuff on the battles, but no one's focused on those everyday people, you and me. How people in our demographic made it, right? So I said, okay, I've got all these stories at many Mitchell archives. Then I was like, I wonder if there are more. And there were. I started going through old text that crumbled in your fingers when you picked them up, or text that somebody at a library or an archives had stored somewhere in the back corner, and they were in pieces. And you've seen those old stuff your parents probably had, and they're like crumbling. Well, when they crumble, they're gone, right? So I started pulling that stuff, and I started flipping through and getting these stories and these things. Newspapers that were newly digitized, but between the time they were put on microfilm back in the 1960s, anybody know who microfilm is? You know how difficult it is. And so today, well, there was this big gap of time where nobody touched the microfilm. So I was going through the microfilm, pulling up and discovering these stories. And then I realized, when I was doing Mobile Under Siege, putting this together, there was nothing about the time that people lived in the city after the Battle of Mobile Bay and before the surrender. Nothing. So when I put this book together, I put together the stories according to month. So you're actually going through it with the actual people and their observations. And some of the cases, their documents and their diaries, they have them in different segments. So when you read this, you're following stories. You're going to follow the story of Joseph Locke. He's a Jewish man in Mobile who stopped here in Mobile on his way to New Orleans. Met his wife in the Eagle Park. Married her. Met his girl he fell in love with in the Eagle Park. Married her. Had a bunch of children. Not interested in the war at all. Could care less. He's from Germany. Barely spoke English. Couldn't care less. But he had to survive. The war happened. His story is in here. How did he survive? Fascinating. Things you just never know. I have to read the book. You'll have to, because it is fascinating, and I could give a snippet, a little here and a little there. He made some compromises. He made some difficult times. But he survived. How did he survive? There was no food in the city. Nothing. How did they make it? That's just his story. And then what about the ladies? What about the society women who were stuck in the city and they couldn't escape? And there was one particular one, and her name was Madame Octavia Walton LeVert. She was very famous for her time, very famous in the city. People would travel all over the world to come meet her in Mobile. Matter of fact, her salon that was on Government Street was one of the places to stop if you were in Mobile doing business. You went to her salon, and the salon was like a meeting place where people exchanged ideas, and you could meet other wealthy people. It's kind of like a fancy restaurant where you know that somebody famous is going to go to, so you're going to go there just in case you might see somebody famous. That's kind of like it was. So she was just internationally known at this point during the war, and she was not sympathetic to the South. She lived here, friends here, but when secession happened, it broke her heart. And so, but she had no choice. She couldn't leave. Her husband was sick. But then she did a dastardly deed. She led Union troops into her house. At the time, in a city that was heavily Confederate in mentality, she had a problem, and it was hard. Well, I started researching her specifically, and that story kept coming up. People who remembered stories that their grandmother had told them, because I was asking, you're a great researcher, collecting stories, and they would say, oh, she was awful, she let the troops in her house build it. That's fine and all, but why was it such a big deal? Why is that still existing today? Why is that mentality? And what was the type of person that she had a very big, beautiful house on Government Street? Her husband was a well-known doctor in the area. Who was she as a person? Who was she that they cared so much? I mean, it's one thing to be, but other people had to be beautiful. Why her? So I started doing research. I love research. I'm straight up a researcher in all forms. And I started investigating, do like CSI, but historical CSI. So I started just diving in and discovering things. One thing I discovered, her grandfather signed the Declaration of Independence. I said, wait a minute. Her grandfather, that's a pretty big deal. Anybody heard of Walton, Florida? Okay, that's named after her daddy. That was George Walton Jr. He was put in charge of West Florida before Florida was a state. Before Florida became the state of Florida, there were two Floridas. There was West Florida, East Florida. He was in charge of West Florida, appointed there by Andrew Jackson. And John Quincy Adams sitting down there. Now, he was a stinker, I will tell you. He got into a duel, stole money from the state of Florida. He was a bit of a challenge. And finding out his story and discovering about him is a whole other amazing story. How she came out so good, I don't know, because he was a stinker, but she did. So then you've got her father was in charge of West